Hello, everybody. Let's go ahead and get started. Thanks for joining me today for our webinar, Navigating Shared Responsibilities, How an MSP Can Support Your CMMC Compliance Journey. My name is Kevin Hancock, Director of Solutions here at ExoStar, and I'm joined today by Tony Giles of NSF.org and Bobby Gare of Axiom. Whoops, let me go ahead and advance the slide here. Sorry about that. So before I get started, just a few housekeeping details. Today's webinar is scheduled to last 45 minutes to an hour. That does include Q&A. Now, you're going to be muted during today's presentation. However, a number of you did submit questions when you signed up for today's webinar, and those will be the questions we'll be answering. If for some reason we have an outage during today's session, hasn't happened yet, but just in case, go ahead and try just to refresh your screen to reconnect. If that doesn't work, you can use that email and use the link that you receive via email to log back in at any time. If at any time you'd like to speak with one of our CMMC experts, if you have additional questions, you can reach out to us a couple of different ways. You can reach us at cmmc-team@exostar.com via email, or you can come to the ExoStar website, www.exostar.com. And there's a chat feature there on every page, and we'd be more than happy to answer your questions that way as well. So with that, let me dive into today's presentation. So this is the agenda we'll be covering. I'm going to start today's session by giving just a current state of CMMC. Then I'm going to turn it over to Tony and Bobby to go over basically how to work with an MSP, what happens during an assessment, how to utilize that shared responsibility matrix, and then we'll dive into that question and answer session. So where are we on the latest ruling? Hopefully many of you know that the CMMC program took effect in December of 2024. That December 16th date is what now allows folks to go ahead and start to schedule your assessments with C3PAOs. It put in place, the rules, regulations, et cetera, around CMMC. The thing that hasn't come yet is that next rule. And that's where the CMMC rule basically gets put into the DoD contracts. That's what we're currently waiting for to get finalized. Now, as many of you know, hopefully, the main thing about CMMC is that it moves your compliance with NIST 800-171 away from self-attestation and you doing self-assessments to requiring that a third party evaluate your program once every 3 years. It defines some additional terms, a CSP, a cloud service provider, and their requirements to be able to, for you to utilize their services. And in those cases, those solutions need to be FedRAMP moderate. And also define the term of an external service provider and what the requirements are around for those as well. Now, obviously, right, we've had a change of administration, a lot of changes coming down the pipe, a lot of things going on in the government today. And one of those things was a regulatory freeze. Now, a number of people are wondering what this impact will have on CMMC. And to tell you the truth, what we think is that it may delay the CMMC final ruling. However, CMMC we fully expect it still to be in place. The reason for this is, this has already gone through the first Trump administration. They were big proponents of this program. The individual who was responsible for the CMMC program in that first administration, Katie Arrington, she was just named a CISO within the DoD. So we fully expect the CMMC program to continue. It just may be delayed a little bit, but we still think it'll be sometime in 2025. And then once it takes effect, there's an implementation plan that I'll show you in just a minute. So for everybody, just to give you kind of a level set of what the CMMC program includes. What it does is it breaks it down into 3 levels. And based upon these 3 levels are your requirements to both safeguard that the information you may receive and the requirements around those. So the majority of the defense industrial base will fall under level 1 CMMC. This is the 63% of the defense industrial base. These are organizations and individuals that don't receive controlled unclassified information. You only typically receive federal contract information. You're still required to safeguard that information, but the burden of that compliance is far less. There are 15 requirements that you've got to meet to protect that information. You need to do an annual self-assessment and an annual affirmation that you're continuing to do those things. When we start to get into the higher levels, level 2 and level 3, is when we start to see the need for this third-party assessment to be done around your compliance with the individual controls. At level 2, you're required to meet the 110 controls of NIST 800-171 Rev 2. Now, there are 2 categories here. There is a level 2 that's going to continue to allow self-assessments. The key thing to keep in mind, though, is that this is going to be driven by the contracting officer. It's not going to be something you can request once you reply or bid on a contract. The contracting officer, when they let the contract, will determine what level that has to be and the requirements for that level. And it's expected that a very small percentage, less than 2%, will allow you a self-assessment of level 2. The majority of the folks are going to require that third-party assessment once every 3 years, and then an annual affirmation. And then for a small portion of organizations, you're going to be required to meet level 3 requirements. Level 3, you're going to have to meet level 2, but you're also going to have to meet the additional 24 requirements from 800-172, and that every 3-year assessment isn't going to be done by a C3PO, it's going to be done by DIBCAC. That's the assessment organization within the DoD who assesses the defense industrial base. Now, once CMMC takes effect, it is going to be implemented over a 3-year period. That first phase, when it finally, when it starts to show up in contracts, it's expected that level 1 and level 2 will continue to allow for self-assessments. After that first year, that's when you'll start to see the requirement for those third-party assessments kick in. So, if, as we believe, right, CMMC will take effect sometime in 2025, then sometime in 2026, a year after that, you're going to be required to have that third-party assessment done before you can bid on those contracts that require it. Then after that first year, we'll start that phase 3. That's where we'll start to get into the level 3 certification necessary. And then we'll go to full implementation after those first 3 years. Now, please keep in mind that blue bar down there at the bottom, that the DoD really can implement CMMC requirements in advance of these planned phases for particular programs. So, you'll want to pay attention to those DFARS clauses of those contracts upon which you're bidding to understand the requirements of that particular contract itself. Now, there are requirements that many of us have today, right? There are a number of DFARS clauses in contracts or that you have or that have been flowed down to you from other organizations within the defense industrial base. If you've got contracts with just the 7012 clause, then you're required to secure controlled unclassified information in accordance with NIST 800-171. If you've got that 7019 clause, you're required to do a self-assessment and score yourself in accordance with NIST 800-171 alpha. That's the assessment guide for NIST 800-171. It tells you the scoring algorithm that you use when you go ahead and score yourself. When you do that, you'll have a score that ranges somewhere between a -203 and a +110. When you do that assessment, you've got to go into the supplier performance risk system and enter your score there. You should continually update that score as you hopefully improve your posture if you don't have that 110 score when you first entered that into the SPRS system. So even though CMMC hasn't taken effect yet, you still do have some requirements around the protection of controlled unclassified information and how you need to protect that. So with that in mind, that should level set everybody where we are today. So I'm now going to turn it over to Tony and Bobby to let them talk about the importance of shared responsibilities and working with an MSP. Bobby, Tony, I'll let you guys take it away.
Right. Thanks, Kevin. Bobby, I know you're coming off mute, getting slides set, ready to go. We'll have a little bit of fun with this one, right?
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting. So again, like Kevin said, my name is Bobby Guerra. I am the CEO of Axiom. I'm a managed service provider. And Tony, you want to mention something again about you?
Yeah, Tony Giles, Director of Information Security for NSF, and we are a CMMC C3 PAO.
And how do we know each other?
We've worked together. You know, we've worked together. It's funny because we got a question about something on a system or hardware, and when I hear CMMC, I kind of instantly go to manufacturing, and then I realized that one of our first CMMC customers is a service-based business. So it is Bobby. So we've worked with Bobby in the past in Axiom and his group, and that's how we got linked up and started doing this. I think we got a lot of the same philosophies, and I think this is really interesting in the security space.
Yeah, because just to make sure everybody's tracking what we're saying is I'm a managed service provider, and I decided 32 CFR talks about that organizations can volunteer to be assessed. And so NSF was the organization we chose to do our audit. So they assessed our MSP. We went through and passed. Now we're waiting with everyone else for the cyber AV to get the certificate process finished before we can officially state that fact. But we learned a lot of interesting things about when Tony and his team was doing the audit of us. We started looking forward and thinking to ourselves, what is this going to look like when we have our clients going through this, when they're talking with C3POs? And so Tony reached out to me and said, let's do this presentation to sort of talk about what this might look like and what are some concerns and things that organizations should be thinking about. And I thought this is just a fascinating thing. We're going to talk about like the before phase, because keep in mind, everybody, this process, although we do tend to talk about the shared responsibility matrix or the CRM or SRM, however you want to call it, but right, Tony, the relationship between the managed service provider and the organization getting assessed is well outside that document. There's a lot of things that they need to divide the duties, and they have a massive impact on your assessment process, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. What's inherited or what is potentially to be inherited, what they can, what that MSP is supporting with. And we'll talk a lot about that. I think that slide with the graphic, Bobby, when we get into actually controls, right? We can take full responsibility. We can take partial responsibility, what the OSA or OSC is actually responsible for. Out of that, it's interesting, but it starts really early in this process too.
Yeah.
It starts. You're engaged. The MSP is engaged in phase one. Yeah, I mean you're starting that process very early.
So we kind of talked through this. That's why you see in here what to know before, during, and the future. So we're going to talk a little bit about the future concepts of how inheritance might work, and so we'll get in that. So can everybody see my slides? Tony, can you see it? Are we looking at it? Is everything good? Kevin, we good?
Yep.
I got it,
Bobby. We're good.
I got it clean.
All right, so let's talk about the slides here. We're not going to cover it in a ton of detail because the next slide we're going to go into more about it. But what we want to do is show here in the slides, on the left is the external service provider references in the 32 CFR rule. And I just want to read that little section under inheritance in 32 CFR. It says ESP, and in this case, we're referring to managed service providers because a managed service provider falls under that category. that are not a CSP may request a voluntary CMMC assessment for their environment and use that as a business discriminator. That's what we did. The market for the ESP services will adjust to find efficient manner for the ESP to support OSA environments that may include their services. What do you think that means, Tony, when they say that?
Oh, I mean, it's you're supporting their services. I mean, you're
Right.
supporting that organization. I mean, you see it even in the scoping guide. Like when you
Yeah.
jump to that scoping guide, I mean, you're right there. An ESP, is within an OSA scope. And what
Yeah.
I mean, what did you spend phase one doing? Defining your scope.
Right. And that's a lot of acronyms to talk about. But what I feel like that statement is really trying to do is to open the door for the MSP like ourselves to have discussions with the C3PO that's going to be doing the assessment, to come together to try to understand how companies like ourselves that have been audited already, how can we not repeat that process more than we need to? How can we shorten that? How can we increase the efficiency of the audit? But in here, in the scoping guide, there are some key points here. That first bullet is it's saying, hey, the company that's getting assessed, if they're using MSP, their SSP's got to call back. It's got to call out how that organization is working with them. So that's something that's really important. If you're working with an MSP and you've got a system security plan, how does it refer, right, to that MSP? And the next bullet under that, it talks about the CRM, the customer relationship document, which we're going to talk about a little bit more. And then this little highlighted one here, it says, consider the agreement in place with the MSP, such as the service level agreement. So Tony, as the C3PO, you guys are going to want to see the service level agreement that the MSP is providing to that company, right?
Correct. Because that OSA, again, they're relying on that MSP for that service. So we're going to be looking for SLAs. And that whole concept of inheritance, the concept of SLAs isn't new in the security space, but really that the process of inherited controls and how you can inherit those controls, that is fairly new in the security space, where NSF is, an ISO, we get involved in the ISO side of the business. This is new on the CMMC side and understanding how that MSP can support.
So it in this situation, like for the system security plan, I want to share, I'm going to call an audible here. This is probably not really the best idea in a presentation, but I think it is really helpful if you're, for people to see sort of what I'm talking about. I'm going to bring this up. Do you see this right here, this inheritance highlight that I have here? Are you able to see that okay?
Yep, we can see
Gotcha.
that.
So this is an example of AC L1311 system access, the old stalwart. A lot of people start with that on their assessment. But in here, see how we're calling out an inheritance statement straight off. This is the client. So this is the templates. We've created a whole system that we provide to our clients, and it has the templates. And in here, at the very beginning, we say inheritance statement. We inherit portions. This is the client saying we inherit portions of this control from Axiom per their system security plan. And it goes through and it describes that, and it breaks it down by assessment objective: Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, Delta, Echo, Foxtrot. And it goes through and it defines it. That's an example. That's not the only way you can do it. You can do it different ways, but this is an example of where you would see the client system security plan calling back to the MSP and clearly defining. Now, it's also going to be in the shared matrix, which we'll talk about more. But that gives you, is that helpful? Do you think that's a good example? I think that's helpful.
Yeah,
actually.
I think that is good, because just to kind of interject here, we tell our customers the same thing, because ExoStar offers a service in this space. We have a shared responsibility matrix. It's like, just because it's in the shared responsibility matrix, you still got to call it out in your SSP. This is what you do.
Perfect.
This is what they do.
That is so beautiful, Kevin. And I love that, because I don't think a lot of people are talking about that. That is a really big deal. And you don't want to get caught flat-footed also in your agreements, right? So, and why, Kevin or Tony, why do you think that the DoD is very curious, and they included it in the scoping guide, that they want to see in the agreement that inheritance flowing down to the MSP? Why is that important?
Well, we can go to that level of access, right? I mean, it's the very first control, right? That level of access. And gosh, I mean, they want to know, because again, the organization is partially shared. The organization has to tell you who to provide access to, and then the MSP is going to provide that access, right? But the MSP, keep in mind, depending on what type of service they have with the MSP, the MSP itself could, they're going to have access to information and what that looks like. So, I mean, there's a lot of interest in that MSP space because people give MSPs, it's, here you go, here's everything, and we need you to do the IT stuff, and we're going to do this other stuff.
It's so important, like Kevin said, Exostar, because they're a larger organization, they understand these requirements very, very well. They understand that you have to have this in your agreement. They understand that you need to have this in your CRM. They understand that you need to have this in your SSP. But smaller MSPs like ourselves that are coming into that space, that's not always the case. And so I think that's a big call out here that, when you're using someone like Exostar, you've been able to dive in their arms about that. But if you're coming into a smaller MSP like us, you need to be able to make sure that you're asking these types of questions and wanting to know that they have that type of information in their system. Does that sound fair?
Yeah. Yes.
Now, the shared responsibility matrix, where do you see, Tony, in the audit? Would you see that coming into phase one? I think so. I think you would want to look at that to at least some extent in phase one in the audit.
You're looking SSP, you're looking shared responsibility matrix, you're starting to gather those artifacts phase one.
Mm-hmm.
And like you said, that SSP that you showed, that example you showed, it called back to the MSP. So, you see an OSA's SSP, it calls back to the MSP. Once you see that on the system security plan, you're starting to understand, okay, here's the scope. You're really trying to define that scope in phase one. You're then starting to think, okay, they have where is the shared responsibility matrix? You want to make sure you have the information that, properly aligns the scope, properly defines the scope. And then, how are those assets going to be, impacted and walked through? Who are we going to be, what are we going to see? Who are we going to be talking to?
And in that SSP and the agreement, for us, the way that we look at it, the way we think at it is that agreement needs to provide the teeth that's required for the Department of Defense to feel like they put it on the line in order for these controls to be met correctly. And if they aren't, the DOJ, if they get involved, that the MSP is going to be on the hook legally to make sure it's done. And if that's not happening, if an auditor looks at that and sees no references at all to the matrix, no references to the inheritance, no reference to the MSP being responsible for those, how valuable is that agreement? Probably not. And it could jeopardize your assessment. So, I mean, that's a big deal. Not a lot of people talk about that, but it is a pretty big deal. So let me go on to the next slide here. All right, so let's talk about. Did I miss one? Let's see here.
No, we're into the tango. We're into the tango.
We're in the tango. Okay, so
we're in the tango, man. We're dancing.
Kevin, what do you think tango? Tony, what do you think tango when we talk about that? It's a weird it's a weird term. I'm not sure. Maybe we made it up, and if that's the case, I'm patenting it right now. But like assessment tango, what do you think that means?
I think it's just it is that exchange of information, right? It's what does this assessor expect from me? And what do I expect from them? How are we going to meet in the middle, if you will?
Yeah, a solid MSP that's going to step into this space. Tony, how many times have you had an organization come to you and say, we're ready for assessment, and it's, all right, 311 Alpha, go, and they look at you like, what do you mean go? Like, what am I supposed to tell you right now? Who's supposed to be talking right now?
Who's supposed to be talking? Who's supposed to be talking? Evidence gathering. Who's supposed to be talking?
Right.
It's yes. When we start off, let's see the access. Who has access? Hold on. Let me find that. And that's when it starts. It's the tango is the dialogue between the C3PAO and the OSA. Bobby, we had quite a tango going on throughout the entire process for all of us. There was artifacts flying in the evening. There was, trying to get things over. There's a lot of reviews and pre-assessment work that goes into this process.
Absolutely. Yeah. Go ahead, Kevin.
Yeah. So Tony and Bobby, like when, Tony, since you were doing the assessment, Bobby, you were the OSA in this case.
They were hammering me. They were
not
right.
Gentle. That's right. Exactly. So did you get, like, was there a pre-packet? Was there a pre-exchange of information that you first reviewed, that kind of thing? Because that I think, if you will, sets the stage quite a bit.
Yeah, we said to ourselves, okay, if I cannot get the auditor to understand very quickly that 3.1 alpha is met. If they can't get their head quickly, if I don't have a process already defined that I want to walk them through quickly and logically, I have failed, because now they're going to start asking additional questions. They're going to start probing. You do not want any more dwell time for your auditor than absolutely necessary. You want them to get in and get out. So what we did is we did a self-assessment of ourselves. We wrote down all the relevant evidence, the documents for each assessment objective, and then we actually created a test script process that we were ready when the auditor looked at us, and we gave all that to them. We gave all of the evidence body and everything. So what was nice about that, Kevin, is we were able to shorten our assessment time, because they were, when it came to alpha, they said, well, we saw this. Okay, alpha's good. Bravo. Is there anything additionally you want to share? And the way I take that is, we believe it's met, but do you want to open your mouth and say something that might not make it met? So our response was, nope, we're good. And then they would just go on to Bravo and Charlie and ask additional information. And then they might have some situations where, when we put that information in there, we didn't go in enough detail. They weren't able to wrap their head around it, and they asked more questions. We took some notes about that. So as we're doing it for us with the clients, we want to get that auditor there as fast as possible. I talked a lot about that, Tony. I'm sure you've got some input about that.
No, it's good. No, it's great. You did. The detail was there, and you go through the CMMC process, and you have the, examine, interview, test process, right? Interview is very heavy, because Bobby was stuck on the phone with the NSF team for quite some time, and asking a question. So interview. That whole artifacts we can examine so much. When you want to go deeper, you'll get into, testing scenarios, or, if you want more information and you're looking for maybe that other objective, you would get into testing scenarios. So it's like, hey, I'm gonna test this on you, and I'm gonna try to sign in and do this, and show me that that's blocked, Bobby. Can you validate? You validate this? And that was, but yeah, if you leave it blank, or if it's not detailed enough, my mind wanders, and I ask a lot more. I asked a lot more security related questions. Bobby wanted to avoid all my security related questions, all of those extra questions that I was gearing up for.
Understandable. So we actually did get a question over the thing. When you're saying alpha, Bravo, et cetera, are you talking about the control objectives?
Yeah, the assessment objectives. There's 320 assessment objectives.
Yep.
So the auditors, good auditors are looking at it, and they think, I have to mark each assessment objective off, which you're trained in the training process that you have to do that, and you have to account and put notes for every one of those. So we wanted to try to write that document in such a way that they felt like if they read it, we wanted to do our best shot that they could mark it all met, knowing that wouldn't happen, but we wanted to provide us the best chance. And in our mind, it was time well spent. And it did help us, I would say, maybe cut our audit by maybe a quarter time-wise.
It certainly, it helps with the best. Less interview. It's less interview time, because again, there's more artifacts, there's more information to examine and review.
And a pro tip, an area where I would say that we're getting better, and the more time that we've gone through more and more assessments, knowing that the scripts account for various different controls, and having those test processes account for those helps the auditor see, oh, remember we did this in 312 Bravo, and we did this test here, and that showed you the banner on the login, and now we're at the logon banner. We already did that, but I can show it to you again if you want. And they're like, okay, no, that's good. I remember that. Yes, correct. And then you move on. Like, building that and knowing how that's going to go, the MSP that you're going to work with absolutely needs to understand that. They need to know it in their bones. It needs to be a way of life for them, because they've got to guide the client. Because you don't want the MSP that's going to be working with this OSA and go, okay, now Tony's asking this question, answer it. It's like a deposition. Like, you have to have prepared those clients for the conversations that they're going to have. And we're going to show a little bit later of the breakdown of the percentages of which ones we were responsible, which ones me and the clients were partially responsible for, and which one the clients are solely responsible. So on a lot of that, the clients are going to have to talk. So you've got to coach them through that process. So let's go into phase one here. So in this part, we already touched on it some, so I don't know if we necessarily need to go into it as much. But in this phase one process, it's all about trying to define the scope and make sure that you have the right suitable information to move to phase 2. As a C3PO, Tony, how many times do you see people go into this and not come out of phase 1? How often is that?
It's happening more and more.
Yeah.
It's happening quite a bit. We have to, and that's it. We're not even, phase 1 is system security plan. Let's start to look at it, but really let's define, show us how that scope is there, right?
Yep.
Does that proposed scope cover all your asset categories? Do you have evidence? Are we going to be able to have that information accessible to us? We're looking for that readiness to move to stage, phase 2, and we're not even looking at, we're not even getting into, is this enough? The whole adequacy and sufficiency standpoint. We're really just dialing in on that scope at this point for phase 1, and ensuring that organizations understand what's that scoping boundary.
Yep.
Because I'm sure, Bobby, as an MSP, I am sure you get the organization is just put everything in there, and it's like, oh, okay, hold on, be careful. We need to have a really let's have a really good conversation about what everything is. So
yeah, well, and if you think about it from the managed service provider perspective, for an organization who has no MSP, it's just them. When you're talking about scope, you're just talking about their scope. But when you have an external service provider like us coming in and supporting that client, that's in a conversation that the auditors are going to also have with the MSP. Like, where's your scope in this equation? How are you connecting to that client? Where is your scope meshing with theirs, and how do you connect? That's why I would fully expect that the MSP. This is another reason why I think it's critical that you pick an MSP, an external service provider that has gone through their level 2 audit. If they're going to provide technical control support, you want to make sure that they're having that audit to them, because that's going to force them to have already had a system security plan. They've already had to build it. They've already had to do it. For larger organizations, that's not necessarily the case, but for smaller MSPs, if you're going to engage with someone like us, I would definitely make sure that they're going to be level 2. It's not required, but I think it's something that I highly recommend doing, because it's going to force them to think about building the system security plan and being ready for the audit and have gone through it. Because now when they go to work with the client, they have to now talk about the tools that they're using and how they're connecting to the client and how they could help or potentially hurt that client's assessment. Because if they're using a cloud tool that's not FedRamped, that is grabbing data, the auditor is going to lose their mind through that process. And you do not want to discover that the MSP is using tools that aren't approved. And so if they have their level 2 and everything they're using is inside that scope, in other words, what they're connecting to the client from was the environment they had assessed, then things are looking good. Things are looking good for the client. And so those are things that we just kind of caution clients when they're working with MSPs, that they really do need to think along those lines. They need to start expecting more from their MSP. They want to make sure, and then in phase 1, the MSP needs to be ready to guide the client through what they're going to talk about, and make sure that they know what to say and what not to say, because the more that you talk during your audit, the more it can be used against you or for you.
For you, Bobby, for you, right? But it is so much in success that we've seen, with NIST engagements, or success we've seen with CMMC engagements. It is when the organization, when the OSA, OSC, when they work collectively with their MSP and they are on the same page, those assessments go a lot better than someone that just, let me phone a friend. I'm going to call this MSP up and I'm going to get this tech that they have there on staff and that they can help. And just like you said, and we'll get into the whole phase 2, because phase 2 is, you're really dialing in. You're starting to get deep into assessment objectives. You are looking for sufficient information. Do you have the right information? There's 320, AOs that you're gonna go through, and there's a lot of them that can be, that can be part of it. And the MSP, a lot of times, I mean, you have a lot of access. Yeah, like a lot of your global or domain admins for a lot of these environments, and that's not to be taken lightly.
So let's talk about phase 2. So we're in phase 2. We do the kickoff. The C3PO is now they have the collection of the evidence, and now they're starting the personal interview. You want to think along the lines, and we've already touched on a lot of this, I feel like, is that we want to make sure that, and I would go as far, this is me personally, to write down as an MSP, like what the OSA, when it's their turn to talk, what are they going to say? To talk about, like at least give them bullet points, if not coach them specifically through what they need to say and nothing less and nothing more. And then if there's additional questions, that's when you can kind of get in there. It's not that, I mean, the auditors are always rooting for you. They want you to pass, but like you can just start going off on tangents and start talking about things that really start asking additional questions and can just make things harder for you than it needs to be. So just know who's supposed to talk when. I think that's really important. I think we sort of covered this, Tony. We're kind of running, I think, a little shorter on time.
You know what? That was near and dear to the conversation yesterday, Bobby, to make sure we were all Bobby and I got a warning yesterday from somebody to make sure we were both mindful of time. So I agree. I think we jumped into these AOs a lot. I'm looking forward to there's a couple slides coming up that I'm pretty excited about, especially the one in the future.
Yeah, so let's talk about the responsibility. So the responsibility matrix, I think we've already started to define and touch on the perspective that it's more than just a document. That sharing and responsibility, I call them seams, not like SIEM, like your seam tool, but I'm talking about a seam as a joint in between, between the MSP and the client. There's that seam that kind of connects them together where they have to make sure they connect perfectly. In all 320 assessment objectives, that has to happen. They've got to make sure that they're perfectly connected, that there isn't these wide gaps that doesn't connect and you're not sure where that goes. This matrix helps define that better. And they're going to the auditor's going to look at it. But let's go ahead and look at the slide that you're wanting to get to. So Tony, when you look at these numbers, can you walk us through what it means?
This is probably one of my favorite slides in this presentation, and the Axiom team put this together pretty brilliantly. But when we look at the Axiom shared responsibility matrix, it's looking at all 320 objectives. So as Bobby's mentioned, A, B, C, D. I'm not cool enough to do the Alpha, Bravo, Charlie, but A, B, C, D. But we have the 320 objectives, and Axiom's fully responsible or can take full responsibility for 116 objectives, 36%. We got the chart on the side to make the math easy for me. And then partial responsibility. That's partial responsibility I want to talk about, because this is people kind of they wonder, like, well, when we say partially responsible, what do we mean here? Because it goes partial and then it goes fully. And the OSA can be fully responsible for 4 under this axiom. Think about that perspective. You have full responsibility for 4, and if you work with the proper MSP in setting this up, you can set yourself up for a lot of success with full responsibilities and partial responsibilities. But it's access control. It's the first domain. It's the biggest domain. I seem to always get assigned this one to work on. I don't know. I think the team always is like, yeah, we'll give them the longest one. But determine, who has access. So partial responsibility, because Bobby, you don't know.
Right. As the MSP, like, I don't work for that company. I can't hire them for them. So they've got to authorize those people. So that's why it's absolutely going to be partial there. They've got to go through it. They've got to fill out a form.
They're going to tell you who's going to have access. Like, hey, we need these. And then you turn on, identification and authentication. We got the list of who these users are. Right. These have been vetted because we have that, relationship. We have that set up. And now I need to make sure that they can all authenticate through an AD process or whatever that looks like. But and you take that responsibility. I will set them up, but you got to tell me who I need to set up, or otherwise we're giving Kevin access to all sorts of stuff.
Right. And we don't want that. We don't trust that guy. So
no one does. No one wants to see that.
But You start to see how powerful using an MSP can be for you, because you can start offloading some of these responsibilities. Now you start having advocates that's speaking on your behalf. They're controlling a lot more of the conversations when it comes to the audit. And they're also shifting the risk from the client more over to them. That's good if it goes well. It may not be if it goes bad. So that's why, you want to make sure that you're working with an MSP that understands this very thoroughly. Is there anything else you want to add on this, Kevin or Tony?
Well, this is why the MSP's engaged. You asked, like, what's the level of it? You think they're going to be engaged in phase 1? You think they're going to be engaged in phase 2? Absolutely. Absolutely. They're going to be engaged, because they're going to call back to that, where that shared responsibility is. They're going to call back to that MSP. So they will be engaged early in the process.
Are you able to see my mouse moving on the slides here? The little arrow that I have?
I can, yeah.
See that?
I can,
okay, good.
yeah.
All right, well, I just want to briefly talk about the columns so that people can kind of understand what this screenshot is really meaning, just briefly. So obviously this is the actual assessment objectives. Here's the assessment, the statement here: limit, system, access, and control. Here's the assessment objective listed here. But here's the CSP inheritance. What that is basically meaning is, like, if you're using Google or Microsoft for your cloud, like, how are you going to, what is the client expecting to inherit from this control? So this matrix is not just really related specifically to us, but also other third parties like Microsoft that they might be using, and it could speak to what that is, which you would definitely call out in that section where it says inheritance, because it's not just us that we talk about inheritance from the client's SSP. They might have in there, as well as their FedRAMP call out to whatever FedRAMP cloud solution that they might be storing their data in. And then it's the Axiom responsibility. So in this situation, it's partial. Well, why is it partial? Axiom provides policies, procedures, and documents to govern access control, including the definitions and transition functions and authorizing users to permit to execute. The client is responsible for authorizing these policies and basically following the forms and doing that. And they kick it over to Axiom to then actually set them up like you talked about. So this is sort of laying that foundation, and then it's more detailed in the SSP. And now, what is this consulting and flexible and flexibility statement? What this is doing is, there's organizations where, there might be a situation where there's an MSP who's doing the piece, but they have another consultant that organization has that comes in and is providing help with designing and working with their procedures. For example, how do I do the background checks? What is the different processes I do? So they would fill out the sections of the procedures, and this just provides a little bit better visibility. If they had a consultant, what is the areas they can play in and where can they not? And because keep in mind, that system is built already before the client comes on, and it has all the spider webbing connectivity to it, the SSP, the policies, and the procedures. If they start changing stuff around, it can really break things and make their assessment not go very well. So we have that defined here. But this is optional. Like, the way that you can make this column, you can have more or less. It's really up to you. Kevin, I'm sure and Tony, I'm sure you've seen various different shared responsibility matrices over the years.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely. This is a great way to basically break out those different pieces of it, because, as you said, right, there's the shared responsibility matrix, the inheritance that you may receive from another service, all those kinds of things. And the more clearly you can break that out for the assessor, right, the better it is. So you're not digging through things and looking at SLAs and all those kinds of things. You're basically got it broken out into these different categories.
Now let's put a pin in this inheritance conversation you just had, because we're going to talk about it in the next slide, because I think it's so important, because there's so many cool possibilities that we could explore here. Tony, I'm going to go to the next slide, but I want you to kind of talk about this challenge of inheritance and where are we at right now, and and I can maybe try to talk about where we could go in the future in this area.
Gosh, and I mentioned this in the very first, we first started talking. This is very, futuristic, and where we're at the moment is, you want to see there isn't necessarily a shorter assessment. There isn't necessarily a less cost. It isn't necessarily deemed as, significantly more efficient. There's none of those things have checked the boxes yet. But when this is done appropriately, you can get there. But right now, when you jump into an assessment, we still want to see all the AOs. We're going to want to have that dialogue. We're going to want to have that dialogue with the MSP. And Bobby, from your standpoint, if you wanted to argue with me down the line, right? We have one of those
right.
One of those tangos, right? It's Tony, you've assessed our system to level
Right.
2. If the customer, it uses Axiom, and they have a shared responsibility matrix from us, and we are called out on there, what do you really need to talk to me or look at that information for?
Right.
It might not be all of it, right? That's a big play for the future.
Yeah, and don't hear what I'm not saying. What I'm not saying is that the MSP doesn't have to show up to the audit. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is, I believe that this sentence that we have highlighted in blue provides the possibility that MSPs can start having conversations with C3POs and start forging the way to have a shorter assessment that involves less cost and is more efficient because of the fact that they've already been assessed at a level 2. Kevin, what's your thoughts about that? I'm curious.
Yeah, and actually, we just got this question over chat as well. It's like, well, how do I go about assessing my MSP, right? And those kinds of things. So it is that, right? Like the first place I'd always look at is the Cyber AB and their website and see if they're an RPO, right? Are they a registered practitioner organization? Are they not? And then it's kind of that. Are they CMMC level 2? Are they looking to be, right? Are they looking to go through that process kind of thing? Because as you said, if they've done it, and this will come with time as well, right? As people,
for sure.
right? As the more the more assessments their customers go through, the more the assessors will know, oh yeah, okay, this is Axiom. We've worked with them before. They're good.
Right.
I mean, for lack of a better word, it's kind of, I think that'll be where people look.
Yeah,
they meet the requirements, right? I mean,
right.
You're showing we have that.
Yeah.
No, and the way that I look at it, and this is purely theory, I'm going to share something that is 100% theory. So saying that right now. But the way that I look at it is an MSP provides really kind of sort of 2 services. They have the infrastructure they're providing. So they might have a tool like Exostar has, I'm sure, tons of tools and options that you might provide to the client, right? And those may have already been audited through some process, maybe a level 2 audit. And those are conversations that when you go into the audit, that could be a straight inheritance because it was fully in scope of a full level 2 audit or even a FedRAMP assessment. And at that point, you've got some real teeth there that you can say, this has really been examined and looked at. And if you think about that and have that conversation with your C3PO, those could be straight pass-throughs. And this is my theory. This is 100% theory. And then the other piece is services provided. So the MSP might be managing your Intune. They could be managing your other pieces of your container. Okay, well, maybe they already had their assessment and their scope looks very similar to yours, and they have the existing procedures and policies, and that's how they implement it for you, and that's what they got assessed against. Can that carry over? Those are conversations that I think the MSPs are going to be having with C3POs, and they're going to be talking, they're going to be trying to forge a path forward to provide a better and more efficient way for this, because it has to happen. And I think this sentence is what it's calling out for. That's what it's asking, but they didn't define it specifically, which I'm okay with. But that was just my opinion. So again, big air quotes on that one.
I think it's great. And I'm excited about this for future opportunities and for other standards. Because again, if you're an MSP, I mean you're brought in to do the infrastructure. You're brought in to do the security controls potentially, right? You're not the organization. They might look at you and say, I don't really have this stuff. So can we just talk to the MSP? And you look, you say, oh, the MSP's got X, Y, and Z. All right, this is great. All right, let's go to the next. You're spending less time as an assessor on that.
One thing I do want to share is we do have a podcast. It's called Climbing Mount CMMC. It's in the resource section later on covered that Kevin will show in the slides. Check it out. We talk about our journey and what we went through. I think Tony, you had some information in there. Well, also check me out on LinkedIn. Send me a friend invite. We're very transparent of what we're going through and what we're doing. We love and have a passion for the DIB space and protecting the warfighter. It's something that we absolutely have a love for. So.
No, thanks. And Bobby, we got same thing. We got the NSF LinkedIn page. We got my LinkedIn page. Feel free to engage. Send a friend invite. Kevin's got some other links from NSF. We got kind of a readiness piece that you can fill out that's just got some basic questions that you can walk through. But we are jumping to questions. I do, Bobby, though, have to just interject really quick. And the technical folks and Bobby and I, we get to do all the assessments and all the talking, but two individuals that really helped with the content, Kaylee from Axiom and Hillary from NSF. They're on the marketing side. They did a outstanding job to make sure Bobby and
make us look good.
They made sure that Bobby and I had good content. So Kaylee, Hillary, thank you both so much for putting this together.
Thank you.
Thanks, team. So everyone, my colleague Joe is going to put up a poll. Would appreciate your feedback on that. This helps us let us know how we did today, as well as ask you questions about additional content you'd like to hear in the future. So I'll let that get posted. While that goes, let me kick into some ExoStar commercial, and then I'll jump into the Q&A. So as you go through your CMMC journey, ExoStar has a number of solutions that can help you on your way. We have an application called Policy Pro, which allows you to create or use templates, customize those for you, take existing policies you have, run those all through an AI engine, score those based on keywords and indicators of what those policies say and how they and what improvements they need to make. We've talked a lot today about managing that overall CMMC program. ExoStar has an application called Certification Assistant that really allows you to gather all that information in one place, put it into those inheritance models, let you know what your implementation statements, your evidence, et cetera. Again, centralize all that information. If you don't have a control in place, allows you to open a POAM against it. We also have an application called our Managed Microsoft 365, which is an enclave up in Microsoft's Azure GCC High based on Teams that provides you that enclave to store, process, and transmit CUI, shrink that overall system boundary that you might have. And then we work with partners like nsf.org, Axiom, et cetera, to provide you kind of really whatever kind of CMMC assessment you need to do or help you get ready for those CMMC assessments. So with that, let me dive into some useful sources of information. As you maybe saw in chat, you will be receiving this slide deck as well as a recording to today's presentation. We'll go ahead and also include these slides with additional information. This includes those links to the podcast and the readiness tool that both Tony and Bobby mentioned as well. So we got a few questions that came in. And so I'll ask Bobby. I'll let you answer number one. If your MSP is CMMC level 2 certified, are the inherited controls actually assessed during the CMMC assessment?
As of right now, I think there's going to be a lot of those that will be, but this is going to shift over time. I think it's going to happen. I think there's a lot of logic that shows that you can do that. I think also there's some wisdom where the MSP that gets audited builds those relationships with the C3POs, shows them, kind of opens the kimono up with those C3POs and says, here's how we operate, here's how we're working, this is how we roll. And I think that starts helping them understand the risk and how they're mitigating it. And that starts making their mind start thinking about the possibilities of accepting more of those inheritance processes, especially if they've already gone through audits with them.
Sounds good. Thanks. Tony, I'll let you take number two. So when does our self-assessment due? How do we submit that?
You kind of talked about this early on in the presentation, Kevin. When you start talking, when's our self-assessment due? We should be looking at NIST 800-171, and we should be entering that SPRS score. So you want to make sure you're entering that SPRS score, updating as we go through, as the organization goes through that process. So you should be getting that SSP, getting that system security plan defined. Look at those EXO tools to build that SSP if you don't have one, and then start to again fill in what that SPRS score is going to be and what it's going to evolve to.
Yeah, but just a reminder to everybody, so that the supplier performance risk system that you're entering the score into is actually used by the DoD. Now, only the DoD sees what you put in there, but they actually do use that as one of the measures of when they're letting contracts. So, I would encourage everyone to, to do what's necessary, what their contract says today. Okay. I'll let Bobby, Tony, you guys tell me who wants to answer number 3. So as a reseller of off-the-shelf products from manufacturers, how do we identify our compliance requirements?
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, I mean, I think, off the shelf, I mean, technically that doesn't fall under CUI. It's off the shelf. It's COTS. But I think a lot of that comes to the DFARS. Like, you look at the contracts, the DFARS are supposed to specifically define it, especially with the FAR rule that came out that is now going to have the form that's going to require a specificity about how those types of data are going to flow. So if you don't have CUI in your agreement, then are you talking level 1 or nothing at all? Like, I think a lot of that is solved in the contracts. And I think having an attorney who understands those in general is a good idea when you're looking at your contracts, because don't take that for granted. You don't want to find out incorrectly.
Yeah, absolutely. And I would just echo that, right? Typically, if you're off the shelf, you're CMMC level 1, and you'll be required to do the FCI, right? That's those 15 requirements. But there are still, right, you still got to self-assess. You've still got to do that yearly attestation that you actually do those things. So just make sure you're in compliance with your contract.
6 years, you got to keep the history.
Yeah.
Exactly. So Tony, I'll let you answer number 4. How will CMMC? Do you want me to answer?
Wait a minute, okay. Kevin, you're asking, like, we read through these in advance. Kevin did a great job. I think Kevin had the best response on question 4 when we went through it. So Kevin, how about you answer? Kevin did great.
I'll take 4. So how will CMMC apply to non-US based companies? So it will still apply, right? So these are contractual rules from the US Department of Defense. If you're a non-US based company that has a contract with the DoD, the US DoD, with these clauses in your contract, you will need to comply with CMMC, right? If you're level 2 and you have those DFARS clauses that require it, you'll have to do the CMMC assessment. At some time, there may be reciprocity with other agreements, but that's not in place yet. So as this rolls out, you'll be required to. There's my answer.
It's a great answer. It's a great answer. Great answer. We got the story on 5 though, because Kevin and I were talking about question 5, and both of us start manufacturing, and we're like, well, what type of company? What would this? and then Bobby's mind goes, it's virtualization and all this other. They're going to have some VDI, and then I started thinking, my gosh, my first CMMC customer is all virtualized. Why I didn't even think of it, but yeah, and that's right. Yeah, Bobby, I think your virtualization stuff on this is
we're 100% work remote. Our organization is, like, we have people in North Carolina, Ohio, Georgia, Kentucky. I mean, we're not just a Florida base. We're national as far as in how we operate, and that's by virtue of the cloud. And so that's why we created a cloud-based solution that is has the FedRAMP ATO. We were able to allow the inheritance process. We kept it all in there. We followed the VDI methodology so that the data is not able to leave it. And it worked for us and how we work. But if you have manufacturing, or you have, you've got a drone, you've got to plug in your laptop to pull that data to do stuff, having purely virtual can be very difficult to do. So it doesn't work everywhere, but it worked beautifully for us. So.
Great.
Take that how you like.
I appreciate that. So Tony, Bobby, let me thank you all for joining us today.
Yeah,
we're at the top of the hour, so thanks everybody for attending today.
And thank you, Kevin and EXO for having us. We really appreciate it. Look forward to it. Thank you so much, Kevin.
And hit me up on LinkedIn and connect with us. I always love sharing and talking, and it's always fun. I have a passion for it. So.
Great. Well, everybody, thanks for attending today. Hope everyone has a great rest of the week, and thanks so much. Have a great week. Bye-bye.
Thank you all. Bye.
Thanks, Kevin.